My fiancé smiled and said, "He makes me feel alive." I took a slow breath and replied, "Then you should chase that feeling without me." Before canceling the wedding, selling our house, closing every shared account. Months later, I heard how her alive romance collapsed overnight. "He just makes me feel alive." She said it with a smile. Not a guilty smile, not a conflicted one. The kind of smile that belongs to someone who has no idea how much damage they are about to do. She was sitting across from me at our kitchen table. The same table we picked out together at a furniture store 2 years ago. The same table where we'd eaten hundreds of dinners, argued about paint colors for the living room, planned a wedding that was now 4 months away. She said it like she was telling me about a great new coffee place. Like it was casual. Like I was supposed to smile back and say, "Oh, interesting, tell me more." I didn't say anything for a long time. I just sat there, looking at her face, really looking at it, and something shifted inside me. Not an explosion, not a breakdown. Something quieter and far more permanent. A door, closing slowly, with a soft and final click. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 31 years old. Nicole and I had been together for 4 years, engaged for 14 months. We owned a house together in a quiet suburb just outside the city, and we had a wedding booked for the spring. Venue, caterers, photographer, the works. On paper, we were the couple people looked at and called goals. In reality, I had been sensing something off for about 6 months. I just hadn't been willing to name it yet. We had met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. She was sitting at the far end of the table when I arrived, already in the middle of a story that had the entire table leaning in. She gestured with her hands when she talked, wild and unself-conscious, and she laughed at her own punchlines a half-second before anyone else did. I watched her from across the table for about 40 minutes before I found an excuse to move seats. We talked until the restaurant staff started stacking chairs around us. She had called me first. 3 days after that dinner, out of the blue, she called instead of texted, and that had felt both terrifying and exactly right. We dated for 8 months before either of us said the word serious. We moved in together after 2 years, into a rented apartment downtown that smelled like old carpets and had a skylight in the kitchen that we loved unconditionally despite everything else. We bought the house in our 3rd year together. She picked the neighborhood. I picked the specific street. We compromised on the house itself, which meant neither of us got everything we wanted, but both of us could live with everything we got. That had felt like a mature thing. At the time, it had felt like proof we were built for the long run. I had proposed in the most embarrassingly ordinary way possible. On a Sunday morning in our kitchen, coffee in hand, not a single romantic gesture in sight. I had the ring in my bathrobe pocket for a week, waiting for the perfect moment. And then one morning she was standing at the counter with her hair still messy from sleep, laughing at something on her phone, and I thought, this is it. This quiet, laughing, half-awake Sunday morning is exactly it. She said yes before I finished asking. We called our families. We ordered takeout and sat on the kitchen floor because neither of us could stop moving long enough to sit at the table. That was 14 months before the kitchen table conversation. 14 months during which, somewhere in the middle, something had shifted so gradually I had missed it entirely. The man she was talking about was named Derek. She'd met him at her new job about 5 months ago, a marketing firm she transferred to after getting a promotion. She mentioned him the first time about 3 months in. Derek said something funny in the meeting today, and I hadn't thought much of it. People have coworkers. Coworkers make each other laugh. I wasn't the kind of man who interrogated his fiancée about every name she dropped. Then it became Derek and I grabbed lunch, and Derek thinks the campaign should go a different direction, and honestly, he might be right. And then it became the two of them working late. And then it became a text notification at 11:30 on a Tuesday night that she turned her phone face down before I could see it. I still said nothing. I told myself I trusted her. I told myself that demanding explanations was what insecure men did. But I watched, and I noticed. And the version of Nicole I had known, the one who reached for my hand while watching TV, who fell asleep mid-sentence during movies and laughed about it the next morning, who made terrible puns just to watch me groan. That version had been slowly replaced by someone distracted, someone distant, someone who was always somewhere else even when she was sitting right next to me. There were smaller things too. Things that only mean something in hindsight. The way single threads don't look like a pattern until you step back far enough to see the whole cloth. She stopped telling me about her workdays. Not in an obvious, sudden way, just gradually. The way a river shifts course over years rather than hours. She used to come home and talk for 40 minutes before she even changed out of her work clothes. Now she came in, said hi, and disappeared into the shower. She started keeping her phone on her person at all hours. Not dramatically, not in the way that screams guilt, just always present, always within reach, always picked up before a second ring. She bought new clothes. That sounds like nothing. But she had complained about hating to shop for the better part of 2 years, and then suddenly there were new outfits, deliberately put together in a way her old wardrobe wasn't. Not for me. I noticed that clearly. Not for me. There is a particular kind of attention a person pays to themselves when they are trying to be seen by someone specific. It has a different quality than everyday self-care. It has a performance to it, even when no one else can see the performance happening. I saw it. I cataloged all of it in the quiet part of my mind. The part that knew the truth well before I let myself say it. It started with a Friday night. She'd been out with, as she described them, the work crowd. She came home at 1 a.m., smelling like a bar and lit up from the inside in a way I hadn't seen in months. She was laughing at something on her phone when she walked in. She didn't notice me on the couch for a full 10 seconds. "Oh," she said, startling. "You're up." "I live here," I said quietly. She laughed, a little too loosely. "Sorry, I just thought you'd be asleep." "You've been texting someone since you walked in," I said. She glanced at her phone, then tucked it in her pocket. "Just Mia," she said. Mia was her closest friend from college. I knew Mia's texting style, rapid-fire messages, lots of voice notes, always signed off with some absurd meme. What I'd seen from across the room was one long, slow, careful message. The kind people type and reread before sending. I didn't push it. I got up, told her I was glad she had a good night, and went to bed. I lay there in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Not angry, not even suspicious yet, not fully, just aware. The way you're aware of a storm when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. 2 weeks after that, we had an argument. It wasn't about Derek. It was about the wedding seating chart. She wanted to move her aunt to a different table. I thought it would cause a family issue. We went back and forth, and it escalated into something bigger than a seating chart had any right to become. She said I was rigid. I said she'd been checked out of every wedding conversation for the last 2 months. She got quiet. Then she said something I didn't know how to respond to. She said, "Maybe I just don't know if I want everything we've planned." I looked at her. She looked away. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. "I'm tired. I'm just tired." She went to bed early. I sat with that sentence for the rest of the night. Maybe I just don't know if I want everything we've planned. People say things when they're frustrated. They say things they don't mean, or things they half mean, or things that are only true in that moment and gone by morning. I told myself that's what it was. But it wasn't. The night she said he makes me feel alive, we hadn't argued. That was what made it so strange. We'd had a perfectly ordinary Saturday. Grocery shopping, a walk through the neighborhood, a movie in the evening that neither of us was particularly invested in. We were cleaning up the kitchen afterward when she said she needed to talk to me. I turned off the faucet. I dried my hands slowly. I already knew, on some level, what the conversation was going to be. You always know, even when you're pretending you don't. She sat down at the table. I sat across from her. She started talking about how the last few months had been confusing for her, about how she'd been feeling disconnected from herself, from us, from the life we'd built. She said the wedding planning felt like pressure instead of excitement. She said she didn't know how to explain it. And then she looked up at me, and her face did something strange. It softened, like she was thinking about something warm, and she said, "It's just, being around Derek, I don't know. He just makes me feel alive." The room went very still. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear a car passing outside on the street. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and steady, which surprised me because I expected it to be racing. Instead, I felt something settle, like the last piece of a puzzle that had been missing for months suddenly dropping into place. And even though the picture it revealed was devastating, at least it was clear. At least it was finally, completely clear. I took a slow breath. I looked at her, and I said, "Then you should chase that feeling without me." She blinked. "What? I'm not going to compete with someone who makes you feel alive," I said. My voice was calm. I hadn't planned it to be calm. It just was. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. "What did you mean?" I asked. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I just meant that things have felt different with him, like there's this energy, and I don't know what to do with that." I wasn't saying I wanted to. "Nicole," I said. She stopped. You told me another man makes you feel alive. Silence. You said it with a smile. She looked down at her hands. I didn't say I was in love with him. No, I agreed. But you're not saying you're in love with me either. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. She didn't say, of course I love you. She didn't reach across the table for my hand. She just sat there, and in that sitting there, in that not reaching, in that not saying, every question I had been carrying for the past 6 months got answered in one single heartbeat. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't demand to see her phone. I had no interest in confirming details I didn't need to confirm. The confirmation was sitting right there at the kitchen table, not quite meeting my eyes. I told her I needed to think. I went to the spare bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I was honest with myself. Not about her. About me. About how long I had been making excuses. About how many times I had seen something off and chosen to look away because looking directly at it would mean making a decision I didn't feel ready to make. About how much of the last several months had been me holding my breath, hoping it would pass, hoping she would come back to me from wherever she had gone. She hadn't come back. She was choosing to stay wherever Derek was. And I could either spend the next decade competing for someone who had already started leaving, or I could be the one to close the door while I still had the dignity to do it quietly. That part took about 30 minutes to figure out. It was the most honest 30 minutes I'd had in months. The next morning, I told her I was ending the engagement. She cried. I expected that. She said she hadn't meant it the way it came out. I said I believed her. She said she didn't want to lose me. I said I understood that. I said it softly, and I meant it. Not to be cruel, but because there's a kind of understanding that doesn't change anything, that just exists alongside a decision that's already been made. She asked me to tell her exactly what I was feeling. Some part of me recognized that as a last attempt to find something she could work with, some thread of emotion she could pull until the whole fabric came undone and we were back in the territory of ambiguity, back in the space where nothing was decided and everything could still be negotiated. I didn't give her ambiguity. I told her exactly what I was feeling. I said, I feel like I have been slowly losing you for 6 months and I chose not to say anything. And now you've said it out loud for me. And I am grateful for that because I would rather know than not know. But now that I know, I can't unknow it. She said she was confused about her feelings. I said I believe that too. But confusion isn't something I can fix, I said. And I'm not willing to spend the next year watching you figure out what you want while I sit in this house wondering every day whether you're still choosing me. She said that was unfair. I let that sit. Then I said, gently, I think you sitting at our kitchen table and describing another man the way you described Derek is what's unfair. I'm just responding to it honestly. She had no answer for that. She asked if we could talk to someone. A therapist. Couples counseling. I thought about that for a moment. I genuinely did. And then I thought about sitting in an office with a stranger, trying to explain why my fiancée had smiled when she talked about another man, and trying to figure out if that was something that could be unknotted. I didn't think it could be. Not because I was unwilling to try, but because I had learned something the night before, sitting in the dark in the spare bedroom. You cannot rebuild trust with someone who hasn't yet decided what they want. Therapy works when both people are fully in the room. Nicole wasn't fully in the room. She was somewhere else, thinking about someone else, and until she figured that out for herself, there was nothing a therapist or I could do. I said no to counseling. She cried harder. I handed her a box of tissues and left the house for a few hours to give her space. My best friend's name was Qley. We'd known each other since university, and he was the first person I called when I drove away from the house that morning. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened. There was a pause on his end, not awkward, just thoughtful in the way that Cole's pauses always were. Then he said, what do you need right now? Not are you sure, not maybe you should give it more time. Not have you thought about what she might have meant by it, or people say things in weird ways sometimes. Just what do you need? I told him I needed someone to talk to who wasn't going to try to fix it. He said, come over. I drove to his place, and we sat on his back porch for 3 hours. His porch overlooked a small, unkempt garden that he kept promising himself he'd fix and never did. And there was something comforting about that, about the weeds and the overgrown edges and the total absence of anything manicured or performed. We didn't spend the whole time talking about Nicole. We talked about other things too, football, a road trip we'd been vaguely planning for years, a book he'd been reading that he insisted I had to pick up immediately. He told me about a terrible date he'd had the previous weekend involving a restaurant that double-booked tables and a woman who was thoroughly unbothered by the chaos in a way that Qley found both fascinating and unsettling. We talked until the light changed, and somehow that helped more than any amount of dissecting would have, because it reminded me that there was a whole world outside that kitchen, outside that table, outside that conversation. A world that didn't begin and end with whether Nicole chose me or chose Derek. I went home that evening with something I hadn't had in months. Not happiness, not even close, but clarity. A few days later, I called my parents. That was harder. My father was a quiet man who expressed concern through practical questions rather than words. He asked about the finances, about the house, about whether I had spoken to a lawyer. My mother cried, which I had expected. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "Your grandfather would have done exactly what you did." My grandfather had been dead for 7 years. He had been the most steadily dignified man I had ever known. I didn't say anything, but I held that sentence for a long time. Still hold it, actually. The practical dismantling of a shared life is a strange, methodical thing. It doesn't feel real at first. It feels like you're moving through a fog, making phone calls and sending emails about something that must be happening to someone else. I made a list, an actual written list, because that's how I operate when something is too large to hold in my head without it spilling over. Venue, caterers, photographer, florist, band, hotel block, invitation printer. We had ordered the save the dates, but not yet the formal invitations, which was one of maybe 3 pieces of luck in the whole situation. I called the wedding venue first. The coordinator had a kind voice, the kind that suggested she'd had this exact call before. I told her we needed to cancel. She asked if we wanted to postpone instead. I said no. She said she was sorry. I said thank you. There was a cancellation fee. I paid it without argument because arguing about it would have required me to feel something about it, and I didn't have room for that feeling yet. Then the caterers. The woman on the phone said, "We hope things work out for you both," and I said, "Thank you," and hung up and wrote the next name on my list. Then the photographer, who was actually very gracious and told me he was sorry and returned part of the deposit without being asked. I sent him a thank you text after the call. He deserved it. Then the florist, the band, the hotel block we'd reserved for out-of-town guests. I had called Nicole's mother's cousin, who had been flying in from out of state and had already booked her flights. That call was uncomfortable. She asked what had happened, and I told her the short version, that we had decided not to move forward. And she made a sound on the phone that was somewhere between sympathy and something else entirely, the kind of sound that told me she had probably suspected something before I had. Each call was its own small closing ceremony. Each one was another layer of the future we'd built together, quietly dismantling itself back into a pile of separate pieces. I made all the calls in one day. I didn't want to stretch it out. Stretching it out would have given it more power over me. There is something clarifying about completion, about being able to cross something off a list and know that it is genuinely done. By the end of that day, the wedding was gone. It existed only in the venue's cancellation records, in the refunded deposits, in the save the dates that people had put on their fridges and would quietly take down in the coming weeks. Gone. And I sat at the desk in the spare bedroom with the completed list in front of me, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not grief, not relief, not yet. Something more like the stillness that comes after a very long effort. The absence of momentum. The quiet at the end of a very long, unnecessary sprint. The house was harder. We had bought it together, names on the deed, mortgage split down the middle. I spoke with a real estate attorney, an old colleague of Qley's, who walked me through the options without making me feel like I was drowning. Nicole and I had one of the more difficult conversations of that period about the house. She said she wanted to stay. I said I understood that, but the math didn't work unless one of us could buy the other out. She didn't have the finances to buy me out. I didn't want to stay, so we agreed to list it. The realtor came on a Tuesday morning, walked through, gave us a number that was higher than either of us expected. That stung in a strange way. The house had appreciated. The house was doing great. The people in the house were falling apart, but the house was doing great. We accepted an offer within 3 weeks. The closing date was set for 42 days later. I had already started packing before she'd fully accepted that this was real. The shared accounts were next. We had a joint checking account we'd opened 2 years in for household expenses. It had been working fine. Bills, groceries, house maintenance, it all flowed through there cleanly. I contacted the bank and initiated the process of separating. There was a balance in the account. We split it exactly in half. Not roughly in half. Exactly. I didn't take $1 more than what was mine. I didn't want to give her any reason to say I had been anything other than fair. Fairness was the only armor I had left, and I intended to wear it all the way through. The credit card we shared for travel points, canceled. The streaming subscriptions we'd merged, separated, each taken back to individual accounts. The gym membership listed under my name, but used by both of us. I called and had her access removed, then sent her the information for her own membership at the same gym so she didn't lose access entirely. That last part surprised even me. I don't know exactly why I did it. I think it was because I had made a decision about what kind of man I was going to be on the other side of this. Not bitter, not vindictive, not someone who took the gym membership as collateral. I was going to be the man who handled his pain without making it her punishment. Not for her sake, for mine. She asked me once, during those weeks, if I hated her. We were in the same house, but living in different corners of it. She had taken the main bedroom. I was in the spare, by mutual, unspoken agreement. She knocked on my door one evening, and I told her to come in, and she stood in the doorway looking smaller than I'd ever seen her look. She asked if I hated her. I thought about it, not to be dramatic, but because I wanted to give her an honest answer. No, I said. I don't hate you. I meant it. I think you made a choice, I said. I think you might not have even realized you were making it when you made it. But you made it. And I'm living with the consequences of your choice, and you're going to live with them too. She started to say something. I held up a hand, gently. I don't want to have the conversation tonight, I said. She nodded. She went back to the main bedroom. I went back to the book I'd been reading. We lived in that strange parallel quiet for another 3 weeks, until the house sold, and we both had somewhere else to go. Now let me tell you about the part one hadn't fully understood yet. The backstory that only makes sense in hindsight. Because there are things about those last 6 months, maybe even longer than 6 months, that I had been reading wrong, or not reading at all. Nicole had changed jobs about 8 months before that kitchen table conversation. I knew that. What I hadn't fully appreciated was how much the new job had reshaped her. She came home from the first week buzzing with energy that she hadn't had at her old firm. The people there were younger, faster, more competitive in the way that feels like fuel instead of friction. Derek was part of that environment. He was the kind of person who seemed to generate momentum wherever he went, or at least, that's how she described him, in the months when she was still just casually mentioning him. He was funny. He was ambitious. He said yes to things she was used to saying no to. And there is a seductive gravity to a person like that, especially when you're in a relationship that has started to feel like a routine. Here's the part one had to be honest with myself about. Our routine wasn't unhappy, but it had gotten quiet in a way that I hadn't noticed until it was too late to do anything about it. I worked long hours, not because I had to, but because I was good at it, and work rewarded effort in a more immediate way than a relationship did. Relationships reward slow, patient, unglamorous investment. They reward showing up in ordinary moments. They reward asking the questions that don't seem urgent until suddenly they are. I had been investing in the structure of our relationship, the house, the finances, the wedding plans, without investing in the texture of it, the daily aliveness of it, the asking, the noticing. We had stopped being curious about each other. Not unkind, just settled. And settled can feel like peace, or it can feel like stagnation, depending on which direction you're facing when you look at it. Nicole had been facing the stagnation side for a while. I can see that now. I couldn't see it then because I was comfortable. Comfort had made me unobservant. And unobservant is a slow, quiet kind of neglect that doesn't look like neglect until someone else notices the gap and steps into it. Derek stepped into the gap. I'm not excusing what she did. I'm not saying she was right to smile when she said his name. But I had been asleep at the wheel for longer than I wanted to admit, and fairness, real fairness, required me to see that. What I should have done, and I carry this not as guilt but as information, is looked up from the blueprints of our life and asked her what she actually needed. Not assumed. Not filled the silence with plans and projects and logistics. Actually asked. And if she'd told me she was feeling restless, I would have listened. We might have found our way through it together. Or we might not have. But at least we would have known. Instead, neither of us spoke. And silence, held long enough, becomes its own kind of answer. It didn't change my decision, but it changed how I understood it. I moved into a furnished apartment across the city. It was on the 4th floor of a building with big windows and not much else. The elevator was unreliable. The hallway smelled like someone else's cooking every evening around 6. The couple below me argued occasionally, not viciously, just in the way that two people who are still learning each other sometimes do. I found that sound oddly comforting. Not because I enjoyed conflict, but because it was so purely alive, so unguarded, so completely different from the polished silence that had settled over our house in those final months. The first night there, I sat on the floor, the furniture hadn't arrived yet, and ate takeout from a paper bag and looked at the city lights and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness. Not yet. But the specific relief of a man who has stopped waiting for something bad to happen, because the bad thing has already happened and he has survived it. The worst was over, and I was still standing, still intact, still somehow okay. I sat there with my paper bag and my city lights, and I made a quiet promise to myself. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind you carve into a journal with a shaking hand. Just a small, private kind. That I was going to be honest from here on. With myself first. With other people second. That I was not going to let comfort make me unobservant again. That the next time something needed to be said, I would say it. Not in anger, not with drama, but I would say it. The city blinked at me from across the glass. I finished my takeout. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor, and I slept better than I had in months. I threw myself into work in the months that followed. I was a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, the kind of job that rewards obsessive attention to detail and doesn't leave much room for your mind to wander. That was useful. I picked up a project I had been putting off, a demanding infrastructure renovation that required me to be on site at 6 in the morning 3 days a week. Some people would find that punishing. I found it medicinal. There is something about being useful, concretely, physically useful, in a way where you can see the results of your effort by end of day, that anchors you in a way that nothing abstract can. I watched foundations get poured. I watched framing go up. I watched a structure that had been nothing but blueprints and calculations become something real and load-bearing and solid. I won't pretend the metaphor was lost on me. I went back to the gym, not obsessively, not in the performative way that some men use fitness as a revenge narrative. Look what you're missing, but consistently, early in the mornings before the world got loud. It gave me somewhere to put the restless energy that had no other outlet. I cooked real meals instead of ordering in, because cooking required focus in a way that watching TV didn't. I started with the simple things. A roast chicken on Sunday evenings, which filled the whole apartment with something warm and intentional. Pasta from scratch once a week, because my grandmother had taught me the process when I was a kid and I had let it go dormant for years. There is something quietly restorative about doing things with your hands, about feeding yourself well, about refusing to let the grief express itself through self-neglect. I called my parents. More often than I had in years. I started hiking on weekends with Qley, usually early Saturday mornings before it got hot, working through trails we'd talked about for years but never gotten around to. We'd stop somewhere mid-route and eat whatever we'd packed and barely talk. Those silences were the most comfortable I had in that whole period. I leaned into the parts of my life that had been on the back burner while I was busy planning a wedding that was never going to happen. I read more. I slept better than I had in 6 months. I had a dinner with Qley and some mutual friends one Friday night in a restaurant I'd never been to, and I laughed, genuinely laughed, not the polite kind, for the first time in what felt like a very long time. It startled me a little, that laugh. Not because I hadn't expected to laugh again eventually, but because I hadn't noticed I'd stopped. That's the thing about grief that moves slowly. It doesn't announce itself. It just thins things out, little by little, until the color is gone and you can't remember when it left. And then one day you're at a dinner table and someone says something absurd and your whole body laughs, and you realize, oh, there I am, still here, still capable of this. Slowly, methodically, I built something new from the pieces of the life I'd dismantled. It didn't look like the life I'd had. It looked like something else. Something quieter and smaller and more honest. More mine. I heard about Nicole and Derek through Mia. Mia was Nicole's friend, but she had also genuinely liked me, and we'd stayed loosely in touch after everything fell apart. Not closely, just the occasional message, because neither of us wanted to burn a connection that had been genuinely warm. It was about 7 months after I had moved out. Mia sent me a message on a Sunday afternoon. She said she thought I deserved to hear it from someone who wasn't going to make it dramatic. She said Nicole and Derek were over. She said it had collapsed fast and badly, and that the details were messy in the way that things get when the foundation was never what people wanted to believe it was. She said Nicole was not doing well. I sat with that message for a long time. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and went back to whatever I had been doing. I thought I would feel something sharp, some echo of satisfaction or grief, but what I actually felt was very quiet. Like watching rain fall on a street you don't live on anymore. I'll tell you the details, because I think they matter. Not because they're satisfying, though I'll admit, there's a thread of something human running through this that isn't entirely without satisfaction, but because they illuminate something true about what happens when you chase a feeling without understanding where it comes from. Derek and Nicole had become official shortly after everything with us fell apart. He had left his own relationship to be with her. Another woman, someone who'd had no idea what had been building between them in those late-night work sessions and long lunches. So Derek had done this before. He had a pattern, and this is the part that Mia laid out almost clinically, with the quiet precision of someone who had been watching it unfold from the front row, of generating that electric feeling in women who were already attached, and then riding the high of it, and then doing it again when the high wore off. Because that's what the high does. It wears off. The feeling of being alive in the way Nicole had described, that crackling, restless, consuming energy, it has a shelf life. It is oxygen for a fire, and fires need more and more oxygen to keep burning, or they go out. In the beginning, from what Mia described, it had been everything Nicole had apparently been looking for. New city bars on weeknights, trips planned impulsively, conversations that went long because Derek had opinions about everything and delivered them with the kind of confidence that sounds like depth until you've heard enough of it to notice the repetition underneath. She had posted more on social media than she had in years. Brighter photos, bolder captions, the careful curation of someone who wants the world to see a specific version of their life. I had not looked at those posts. Cole had, apparently, but he had the decency not to tell me until much later, and even then he said it with the measured tone of a man reporting the weather in a city I no longer lived in. About 6 months into their relationship, Derek had started generating that electric feeling with someone else. A woman at a conference, a 3-day industry event in a different city. Nicole found out the way these things are almost always found out. The phone, the messages, the evidence that sits in your chest like a stone. She confronted him. He said it wasn't serious. She asked him if he'd felt alive with the conference woman. He didn't answer that. And the non-answer told her everything the actual words would have taken longer to say. The irony didn't escape anyone who knew the full story. She knew what it felt like to be on the other side of that smile. Because someone else had smiled at Derek the same way she once had at his name. The math was cruel in its symmetry. She had left a man who would have never done to her what Derek did. For a man who did to her exactly what she had, in her own way, done to me. I didn't say that to anyone. Not to Cole. Not to Mia. Not to my parents. I didn't need to. That kind of truth doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. It just is. It exists in the architecture of what happened, and anyone paying close enough attention can see it without being shown. The firm they worked at found out about their relationship when the other woman, the conference woman, came forward to HR. Derek left the company before he could be asked to. Nicole stayed, but the environment had curdled. The late-night energy, the team lunches, the momentum she had found so intoxicating. All of it was now tangled up in the wreckage of a public implosion that people she worked with had watched unfold in real time. She had burned one life for another, and the second life had burned itself down in 6 months. What was left looked nothing like what she had imagined when she sat at our kitchen table with that soft, warm smile. When I heard the full version of what had happened, the part that stayed with me wasn't the betrayal or the collapse. It was something Mia had mentioned almost as a footnote. She said that after everything fell apart with Derek, Nicole had come to her and said something. She'd said, "He never actually made me feel alive. I think I just felt that way because I was scared." Scared of what? I wondered. Scared of the ordinary life she'd already chosen and was afraid was all there was. Scared that she had already peaked, already made all her choices, already arrived at the rest of her life before she was ready. Scared that settling down meant settling. I understood that fear. I think most people do. The instinct to run toward brightness when you're afraid the room you're in is getting dark. But brightness and aliveness are not the same thing. And what Derek offered, that crackling, restless electricity, wasn't aliveness. It was novelty dressed in aliveness's clothing. And novelty, by definition, cannot last. It expires the moment the unfamiliar becomes familiar. And then you're back in a room, just a different one, and the same fear starts whispering from the same corner. She had traded real for the feeling of real, and real is the only thing that holds. Mia asked me, in that same message, how I was doing. I thought about it, really thought about it, the way you do when someone asks with genuine intent. I told her the truth. I said I was more okay than I expected to be. I said the apartment still felt a little empty, but that I was getting used to the way empty could also feel like potential. I said I had started running in the mornings, which was something I had always meant to do and never done when I was with Nicole. I said work was good. I said I had spent a weekend at my parents' place last month, and my mother had made the food I grew up with, and I had sat at their kitchen table until midnight just talking, and it had felt like being handed something I didn't know I needed. I said I was learning to be alone without being lonely. That's a different skill than most people think. Most people treat alone and lonely as synonyms. They're not. Lonely is an ache. Alone is a room. And how you furnish a room is up to you. I was furnishing mine slowly and on my own terms, and I found I had better taste than I had given myself credit for. There is a moment in most men's lives, I believe this now in a way I didn't before, where you are handed a choice that doesn't look like a gift. It looks like the opposite of a gift. It looks like your kitchen table and your fiancé's smile and the words "he makes me feel alive" hanging in the air between you. And the choice is not whether to be hurt by it. You don't get to choose that. The choice is who you're going to be in response to it. You can become the man who spends the next 3 years recounting that moment at bars, getting angrier with each retelling, using her as the reason his life didn't go the way he planned. Or you can take a slow breath. You can let it land. You can look at the woman across from you without hatred. You can say what you actually feel, which is, then go. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough about yourself to know what you deserve. And what you deserve is someone who doesn't have to search for the feeling of being alive when they're next to you. Someone for whom you are the gravity, not the background. I dated someone briefly, about 8 months after I moved out. Her name was Kara. She was a landscape architect with a dry sense of humor and a habit of sending voice messages instead of texts because, as she put it, she typed too slowly for the things she actually wanted to say. We went on 6 or 7 dates over the span of 2 months. She was good, kind, interesting, present in the way that I had stopped noticing people could be. It didn't develop into something more, and neither of us forced it. We had dinner one last time and agreed, naturally, without awkwardness, that we were better as people who had briefly crossed paths than people who were trying to make something that wasn't quite fitting. She hugged me goodbye outside the restaurant and said, "You're going to be fine, you know." I laughed a little. "I know," I said, and I meant it. One afternoon, almost 10 months after the kitchen table conversation, I was in a hardware store, standing in the paint aisle. I was painting the apartment, finally personalizing it, making it mine instead of just a furnished box I happened to sleep in. I was staring at paint samples, holding 2 similar shades of gray side by side, and an older man next to me said, "The darker one." Every time. I looked at him. He shrugged. "The lighter one looks safe." But safe looks like nothing on the wall. I looked back at the samples. He was right. I took the darker one. It took me 3 days to paint the whole apartment, rolling it out on my weekends. When it was done, I stood in the middle of the living room and looked at what I had built. The space that was now genuinely mine. Dark gray walls, warm lamplight, bookshelves that I had actually filled with things I actually read, plants on the windowsill that had survived under my care, which felt like a small victory I was not too proud to appreciate. A coffee table I had bought at a market downtown, slightly asymmetrical, with a gouge in one leg that the seller had apologized for and I had said I liked. A photograph on the wall that I had taken myself. The city at dawn from a trail I had hiked with Qley the previous spring, the light coming in sideways across the skyline. Everything quiet and enormous and unhurried. I stood there in the middle of what I had made, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not just okay, not just surviving. Something that went further and softer and more certain than either of those things. I felt like myself. Not the version of myself that had been quietly disappearing into someone else's idea of what a life should look like. The original version. The one who had opinions about things and reached for what he actually wanted and didn't wait for permission to take up space. He had been in there the whole time. He had just been very, very patient. I think about that kitchen table sometimes. Not with anger. Not even with sadness, exactly. More the way you think about a storm that's already passed. The way you can look back at the sky that had been dark and see that it's clear now and understand that both things were real. Both things happened. The storm mattered. The clearing matters more. I think about what I said that night. Then you should chase that feeling without me. People who heard the story later, Qley, a few others, said it like I had said something wise. Like I had the presence of mind in that moment to deliver a meaningful line. The truth is simpler than that. I wasn't being wise. I was just being honest. I was just saying the only thing that made sense to say to someone who had admitted, with a smile, that another man made her feel more alive than I did. What was the alternative? To argue? To compete? To spend the next several years trying to be more alive than Derek while Derek stood in the corner of her mind regardless? No. The only dignified move was the one I made. To take a breath. To speak plainly. To let her go. Not as a tactic. Not to win something. Not because I knew she'd come back or collapse or learn a lesson. But because holding on to someone who is already halfway somewhere else is not love. It's just fear wearing love's coat. And I had decided, in that 30 minutes in the dark spare bedroom, that fear was no longer a good enough reason to stay anywhere. The last thing Mia told me, in that Sunday afternoon message, was that Nicole had asked about me. She had asked how I was doing. She had asked if I was seeing anyone. She had asked, and this was the part that settled into me most quietly, whether I had ever thought about reaching out to her. Mia said she didn't know if I wanted to know that. I thought about it. Then I texted back. Thanks for telling me. And no, I don't think reaching out would be good for either of us. Mia responded with a single thumbs up. And that was that. There is no grand revelation at the end of a story like this. No explosion, no confrontation, no dramatic scene where somebody says the thing that makes everything make sense. Life doesn't deliver those. What life delivers, if you're patient and honest with yourself, is something more understated. It delivers a Tuesday morning where you wake up without dread. A weekend where you realize you haven't thought about the old life in several days. A moment in a paint aisle where a stranger's offhand comment about gray walls somehow lands in your chest like a small piece of wisdom. A photograph you took yourself, hanging on a wall of a room you made yourself, in a life that is entirely and unapologetically yours. That's what life delivers. Not closure, not victory, just the quiet, honest accumulation of days that belong to you. I'll take that. I'll take that every single time.